Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. Today we wrap up this 8-week lecture series by turning our attention to a particularly complex region of the world, the Middle East. We do so at a time when Israel is at war with its neighbors to the north and south. This is a place, the Middle East, where for generations we've struggled to achieve our ultimate goals, at times even throwing away success when we find it. Take, for example, the situation in Libya. This large North African state, led by Muammar Gaddafi in the 1980s, was considered to be a rogue nation. It supported international terrorism, pursued the development of weapons of mass destruction, and was a destabilizing force on the continent. In 2003, President George W. Bush secured a deal with Libya. It agreed to renounce terrorism, end its WMD program, and apologize and make good for its previous grievances. That deal would fall apart 8 years later. When the Arab Spring arrived, the Obama administration pressured Muammar Gaddafi to step down or at a minimum lighten up on his human rights violations. When he failed to do so, we led a group of NATO powers in an aerial assault that ultimately toppled the government and has cast Libya into pure chaos, with multiple governments claiming to be the legitimate leader of the country and hundreds of armed groups controlling parcels of land. We had stability in Libya. That is no longer the case. Or think about Iran, a country that until 1979 was a very close ally of the United States. After the revolution, it became an Islamic fundamentalist country, denounced Israel and the United States. As it began to pursue nuclear weapons, the Obama administration decided to enter into an arrangement, a negotiated settlement of that issue. Nothing is more central to the development of nuclear weapons than the production of centrifuges. And as you can see from this graph, the number of Iranian centrifuges peaked around 2013 when the United States and its Western allies joined China and Russia in sitting down with Iran to discuss a nuclear deal. Sanctions clearly had not succeeded. When negotiations began, the number of centrifuges flatlined. When the deal was finally struck, the number of centrifuges dropped significantly. This has to be considered a foreign policy success.
I think most experts and countries other than the U.S. under President Trump would say that that agreement was working in terms of setting way back Iran's nuclear program and preventing them from acquiring a nuclear weapon, at least for a very long period of time, and during that period of time other steps could be taken to solidify that and to make sure that Iran would live up to its commitment, which it made in this agreement, that it would never seek to acquire or develop a nuclear weapon.
And then the United States took a different position. Mr. Trump decided to remove the U.S. from the Joint Plan of Action, or what we commonly call the Iran nuclear deal, and instead apply maximum sanctions and pressure on Iran. Our allies have not joined us. After all, they signed the same deal. They're trading with and investing in Iran, and therefore these are unilateral sanctions. And look at how the centrifuges have increased over time. So today Iran is very close to being able to develop a nuclear device should it want. That's a success that's thrown away. Today we're going to focus mainly on the Arab-Israeli dispute and the ongoing war in Gaza. Central to American foreign policy towards this region is what is called the two-state solution. Let's begin there. The two-state solution deals with two individual groups, Israel and the Palestinians. And the idea is that they will each have a nation-state in the historic region of Palestine based upon the borders before the 1967 Lightning War. Accordingly, Israel would own 80% of all the land, the Palestinians 20%. Israel has overtly rejected the two-state formula, and the Palestinians are in no position to negotiate. They have one representative, the Palestinian Authority, which sits in the West Bank, and another, Hamas, which sits in Gaza. Those two don't agree with each other, and they certainly are not ready to engage the Israelis diplomatically. And yet, despite all of these obstacles and obvious signs that the two-state formula is no longer possible, it maintains its position in U.S. foreign policy as it has since 1947. Conflict between Israel and the Palestinians only further erode any optimism that the two-state formula can exist. So where exactly did this idea come from? It dates back to pre-Israel days. In the 1940s, UNSCOP was created by the United Nations. This is the Special Commission on Palestine. It was made up of 11 ambassadors. They traveled to the region, they looked around, they interviewed people, and they returned to the United Nations with 3 options. Option 1, one federal state, meaning the Israelis and the Palestinians would live together with one government and power sharing. 2 independent countries, this is what became known as the two-state formula. Or thirdly, no nation state at all, a mandate administered by the United Nations. When the GA sat to vote in November 1947, they approved the two-state solution. A state for the Zionists, or Israelis, a state for the Palestinians. This is a plan that was doomed to fail from its origins. Each side, Israeli and the Palestinian, was divided geographically into 3 sections. So whether you're the orange areas, the Jewish state of Israel, or the yellow areas, the Arab state of Palestine, you have these choke points. Geographically, it's impossible to defend. It would be very easy for the other side to cut you off from portions of your property and your citizens. This is just not a geographic divide that works strategically. Secondly, the Arab states rejected the state of Israel, and in so doing they rejected the two-state formula. Beyond that, there was very little support in the Arab world for the Palestinians, and both the Palestinians and Israelis simply wanted more land, if for no other reason than to be able to defend it without those difficult choke points. Our Cold War priorities were as follows. We needed anchors in this region. Keeping in mind, the U.S. had very little foreign policy interest in the Middle East until the Second World War ended. We largely ceded this region to the Russians, the Brits, and the French historically. But after World War II, we needed allies, and we found them in Israel, Iran, and Turkey. We wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from reaching the region, gaining access and allies. We ourselves needed access to Persian Gulf petroleum, and we prioritized the Arab-Israeli dispute. That would be Arab states and Israel over Israeli-Palestinian interests and that dispute. Regional priorities? Well, the rhetoric is often as follows. The Palestinian question is at the core of the Arab-Israeli dispute. And when Arab nations say this, what they're telling us is that you cannot solve Israel's bilateral relations with Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or others without first resolving the Palestinian question. Does it get a nation state or not? The reality doesn't look like that. There is the Arab-Israeli dispute, and next to it, somewhat overlapping, but certainly not central, is the Palestinian question. And what this tells us is that we don't have to solve the Palestinian question in order to improve relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The threat dimension for Israel over time, the country was founded in 1948, and overwhelmingly at that time, it was nation states that threatened it. Israel and its neighbors went to war 4 times over that 3-decade period. The War of Independence in 1948, the Suez War of 1956, the 6 Days War of 1967, and the October War of 1973. And these are just the major wars. There were a lot of skirmishes and military exchanges in between. And then something happened, something very important, something that would result in more stability in the region for Israel and its neighbors than they'd ever experienced. And that something was the Camp David Accords. This was a remarkable agreement between Israel and Egypt. Egypt was, of course, the center of the Arab League. It was the most powerful of Arab states, and for it to reach an accord with Israel is nothing short of remarkable. Camp David is considered the gold standard for diplomatic settlements among adversaries. So what exactly did this deal call for? Well, there are two frameworks. Framework one is the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement. Israel gave up all of the Sinai Desert, which it had captured in the 1967 war, held on to in the 73 war, in exchange for Egyptian recognition. Egypt would recognize Israel as a legitimate state with a right to exist, and recognition is one of the most important features of statehood today. This is a deal that essentially took an Israeli-Egyptian war off the table. There was a second framework. There was a plan for a Palestinian state, but that framework received very little attention and was never pursued by the principal actors. Clearly, the priority was the Arab-Israeli dispute as opposed to the Palestinian question. The threat dimension since Camp David continues. There are nation-states that threaten it. Iran is the most obvious, either directly or through its proxies like the Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah. Iran is a serious threat to the state of Israel. But a new dimension emerged after Camp David especially, and that is the threat posed by non-state actors, terrorist organizations. And there's no shortage of names on that list, from the Islamic State to the PLO, Hezbollah, and the Popular Front. They all threaten Israel and Israelis. So how is it that we deal with terrorists? There are quite a few options on the table for any nation state in confronting them. You can pursue a policy of destruction, try to rip them out of the soil, destroy them down to the roots. On the other end of the spectrum is reaching an accommodation, a settlement with them. Isolate them, divide them and weaken them, or address the so-called idea behind them, what gave rise to that terrorist organization. The Oslo Accords of 1993, this held with it the prospect of a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, can be found on the settlement side of the graph. Whereas over here, we have historical Israeli policy, seeking to isolate and divide the Palestinians, among others, and destroy them if the opportunity presents itself. In the green area, between settlement and addressing the idea that gives rise to terrorism, we find most of the international community. So looking at this graph, we can see that the world community and Israel are out of step when it comes to dealing with various terrorist organizations that threaten the Israeli state. Israel's relationship with the world is oftentimes simplified. People will say that the UN, the world, the international community have always hated Israel, and that simply is not the case. Back in 1947, it was the United Nations that approved the creation of the Israeli state, and it viewed Israeli independence in 1948 as a success not only for the Zionist, for the Jewish people, for the Israeli state, but also for the international organization. Statehood and territory, because in that first Arab-Israeli war, we often call it the War of Independence, 1948 to 1949, Israel increased the territory that had been awarded from 55% to 80%. So that original partition plan was almost a 50-50 split, a slight advantage for the Zionists. But Israel captured territory that had been planned for a Palestinian state. By 1949, the Israelis controlled 80% of historic Palestine, and the United Nations endorsed that. It didn't have to do so. It could have said immediately, no, that's territorial aggrandizement, that's illegal. You must pull back to the 55% we originally awarded you, but it supported the state of Israel, allowing it to hold on to that extra territory. And then the relationship collapsed over time, specifically the 1967 war, the lightning war that Israel won. in part because it created such a large flow of Palestinian refugees. The Camp David Accords of 1978 improved prospects between Israel and the world, only to see them decline over time. The Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, and of course the ongoing war with Gaza, is profoundly unpopular across the international community. The war in Lebanon, which is an extension of the Gaza war, does very little to improve Israel's standing in the international community. So where exactly does Israel stand today? At the time of this taping, November of 2024, it is more isolated than it has ever been. It is a partisan issue here in the United States. 10 years ago, it would be unheard of to say such a thing, that Democrats and Republicans have a different view on Israel and its policies. Both political parties supported the state of Israel and had very few questions about its policies and intentions.
Our deep and lasting friendship will only grow deeper.
But over the course of the last couple of years, especially, we've seen a very sharp divide, with Republicans showing significantly more support for Israel and Democrats increasingly critical of its behavior in the war on Gaza and also its attitude towards the Palestinians in general.
We've been working to address urgent challenges that are making it difficult to deliver the necessary humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza who so desperately need it.
There are arrest warrants, war crimes charges, even genocide allegations being processed by international tribunals and courts. This does very poorly for Israel's image in the world, and the territories themselves, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, are now breeding grounds for more terrorist organizations. After this war ends, and we know that it will because all wars do end, we'll be dealing with an area of the world, the Gaza Strip, that will be overwhelmingly destroyed. The vast majority of buildings have been rocked to the ground. The infrastructure, the bridges, the roads, the medical system, the educational infrastructure has been wiped out. Lives have been shattered and communities will be hard-pressed to put themselves back together. And sadly, the idea behind Hamas will remain and probably be dominant. So whether these leaders of Hamas live to see another day or not is secondary to the reality that what gave rise to them is very likely to remain in the Gaza Strip. Thinking through the options. All right, so this war will end, and after it does, Israel has options, the world has options, and of course, U.S. foreign policy options must be considered. Let's start with the Israelis. So what can and should they do in a post-Gaza war era? They could themselves rebuild or encourage the world to rebuild the Gaza Strip to bring back some semblance of normalcy and to allow communities to rebuild themselves. On the other end of the spectrum, it could depopulate Gaza. And there have been high-ranking cabinet officials in Israel who have said that's the aim of this war, to rid it of all Palestinians and allow the Israelis to populate it themselves. And in the middle, there's the status quo, which is the most likely. It's hard to imagine the Israelis would go about the very expensive and difficult and at times dangerous task of physically rebuilding Gaza, and depopulation seems to be an extremist argument. So what is the status quo? It's a situation that's unsustainable, where there's overwhelming human misery in the Strip, and the Israelis would be confronting more hatred there, perhaps, than they've ever seen. The international community also has its options. It can follow through on those arrest warrants for high-ranking Israeli officials, including the Prime Minister and the former Secretary of Defense. There are several ICJ or World Court cases working them through the system. And while Israel may reject the legitimacy of the ICJ, and Americans can question its authenticity, the rest of the world doesn't. The other countries of the world look to the ICJ for legal guidance, and when they issue rulings on issues such as Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories or whether Israel is exhibiting acts of genocide, The rest of the world will respond to that. They won't reject it out of hand. The international community could go so far as to say we're going to recognize the Palestinians. We're not going to wait for a negotiated settlement. That would leave the United States and Israel on the outside looking in, with only a handful of countries supporting them. The rest of the world may just move forward with a Palestinian state recognition, and is very likely to continue to sanction the state of Israel, put pressure on it to change its behavior and its approach to the Palestinians, treat it in many ways as we did South Africa during the era of apartheid. So what would I say about the international community options? And I do think all of these are on the table, and at least some of them will be pursued. They all run counter to Israeli interest, and importantly, not one of them will solve the underlying problem of Israeli security and the future of the Palestinians. How about the Americans? What options do we have on the table? It may be a time for us to stand back, take a breath, look at the long history and the evolution of American foreign policy, and think about maybe making some at least nuanced changes. For the United States, we can side with Israel and we can side with Palestine. We're a sovereign, independent state. We can choose any direction that we want. I will say that that side of the spectrum, siding with the Palestinians, is off the table. We've never been close to that position. We've never considered abandoning Israel, and I don't think it's legitimate to even talk along those lines.
We know that Israel became a homeland as a Jewish state after World War II because the world understood that it had not protected the 6 million Jews who died during the Holocaust. And so President Truman was the first to recognize the state of Israel, and it has become sacrosanct, as it should be, in both Democrat and Republican administrations to ensure Israel's security.
So it's really not a left and right 180-degree spectrum. It's more of a 90-degree turn. And what do we have in that centerpiece? America as the honest broker in the region. This is our historic policy position. From Harry Truman through Barack Obama, the U.S. viewed itself as an honest broker for the Arabs, Israelis, and the Palestinians. We're here to help out. We clearly favor Israel. There's no need hiding that. Everyone in the region knows it. But we're here to help you make a deal, to solve your problems large and small, to bankroll, if necessary, the negotiated settlement, and to help in remediating any difficulties between you. The U.S. policy is right here about a decade ago, and over the course of the last two administrations, Trump 1 and Biden, we've seen this dial move to here, where the U.S. is saying to Israel, anything that you say is correct, and we will support it. And what we have to ask ourselves is that really good for Israel? Oftentimes, allies need to tell their friends, we don't agree with you. We think you might be going down the wrong path. Can we rethink this policy? Can we reorganize and maybe come up with some new options? And the U.S. hasn't done that with Israel for a very, very long time. And maybe at the end of the day, it is exactly what Israel needs, but we certainly should discuss it, whether or not the U.S. should encourage Israel to move in different directions. And, of course, does it reflect U.S. interest? Since the two-state formula has been the centerpiece of American foreign policy since 1947, it's pretty obvious that if the Israelis reject the two-state formula, something's out of kilter here. Either we need to change our centerpiece interest, or we need to encourage the Israelis to think about taking another line as it deals with their neighbors. What future does American support for Israel hold? Should we not question them? Probably means a continuation of what we've seen for the last decade, which is near constant warfare, terrorist attacks against the state of Israel, and countermeasures by Jerusalem. One small step in the right direction, in my opinion. We know that a very large number, some 200 hostages were taken on that horrific day in October of 2023. This is when Gaza Hamas forces stormed across the border attacked Israelis, killing well over 1,100 and taking others hostage. There's been very little success outside of a late 2023 settlement, a ceasefire that resulted in the release of a large number, but since then the hostages have remained in Hamas captivity. Of the remaining hostages, we believe that 7 of them are American citizens. And it's pretty clear that Israel is not going to have success in the near future in having all of the hostages released. Why not an American initiative where we say to Hamas separately, let's talk about this. What exactly do you need from us for the release of those 7 hostages? And if the price tag is too high, if Hamas says, end your support for Israel, or no more military aid flowing into the region, obviously we cannot accept that. If Hamas demands that the U.S. leaves the region altogether, of course that's a bridge too far. But at least broach the issue. Perhaps there are some modest steps that the Hamas leaders would see as sufficient for the release of 1 or more of those American citizens. In other words, we don't have to wait for a comprehensive settlement. We could talk to Hamas directly about the fate of those Americans. I would like to thank you all for joining us in this masterclass, 8 Great Decisions of 2025. I look forward to seeing all of you right here in 1 year for Great Decisions 2026. As always, I encourage you to stay engaged and make great decisions.